You're watching Al Jazeera. A reminder of our top stories this hour. There are some live pictures from Gaza. We've been seeing flares and ongoing explosions. It is pretty dark at the moment, but we have been seeing them in the last half hour or so. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he's got no plans to resign and he will not agree to a ceasefire, likening that to a surrender to Hamas. Netanyahu says he will lead Israel to victory. Israel says a female soldier taken captive by Hamas on October the 7th has been freed in what it calls a ground operation in the Gaza Strip. The woman is seen here in a family photo released by Israel's army. Hamas called the announcement an attempt by Israel to distract attention from the video it released a few hours earlier showing 3 women still in captivity. And Israel has expanded its offensive in the territory. Tanks have been seen moving on the outskirts of Gaza City on a road linking the north and the south. It was seen firing on vehicles carrying civilians passing by. Well, the assassinations of key Hamas figures are among the goals of Israel's ground operation. Michael Apple takes a look at what Hamas is and what it stands for.
The Islamic Resistance Movement, or Hamas, was founded in Gaza in early December 1987 by Palestinian Imam Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. It's an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, an Islamic political group founded in Egypt in the 1920s. In the late 1980s, Hamas rose to prominence around the start of the first uprising against Israel, when demonstrations broke out in Jabalia refugee camp. It extended its arms struggle to a commitment to ending Israel's occupation of Gaza, the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Hamas won parliamentary elections in 2006 and the following year took control of the Gaza Strip from Fatah's Palestinian Authority. It seeks to free historic Palestine, stretching from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, from Israeli occupation. Hamas strongly opposed the mid-1990s Oslo peace accords that were negotiated between the Palestine Liberation Organization and Israel. The accords gave birth to the idea of a two-state solution that was to be implemented over time. Although Hamas's 1988 founding charter called for Israel's destruction, it changed its position in 2017. Hamas launched a new charter accepting a Palestinian state based on 1967 borders alongside what it calls the Zionist enterprise. In the past, it's considered implementing a decades-long truce with Israel, but never a peace agreement. The movement has a military wing, the Qassam Brigades, as well as a social services division. It is this military wing, together with fighters from another faction, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, that launched the October 7th attack on Israel by land, sea and air. Michael Apple, Al Jazeera.
Well, joining us live on Skype from Washington, D.C. is the former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense, Lawrence Cobb. So very good to have you with us on Al Jazeera. I want to ask you about Israel's military tactics in this, or at least its goals. As I was saying to our guest earlier on, my limited understanding of this is that military action is usually best served if it's got one goal, and Israel has 2. It has its stated intent to destroy Hamas and also its stated intent to get the civilians back. How difficult does having 2 goals make it in a conflict like this?
Well, it's very difficult because you have to balance one against the other. The fact of the matter is, whenever you undertake a military operation, you're always going to have civilian casualties. And here, Hamas has increased the amount of civilian casualties by basically putting its forces among the civilian population and houses, hospitals, and schools. So you're going to have more casualties. The Israelis did try.
We're going to take you live to New York, where the head of the UN's Agency for Palestinian Refugees is speaking. We're going to listen in.
The forces of the Gaza Strip are shocking. The level of destruction is unprecedented. The human tragedy unfolding under our watch is unbearable. 1 million people, half the population of Gaza, were pushed from the north of the Gaza Strip towards the south in 3 weeks. The south, however, has not been spared from bombardment, with significant number killed. I have said many times, and I will say it again, no place is safe in Gaza. Now, civilians remaining in the north are receiving evacuation notices from the Israeli forces, urging them south to receive scarce humanitarian assistance. But many, including pregnant women, people with disabilities, the sick and the wounded, are unable to move. What happened and continues to happen is forced displacement. Over 670,000 displaced people are now in overcrowded UNRWA schools and buildings. They live in appalling, unsanitary conditions with limited food and water, sleeping on the floor without mattresses or outside in the open. Hunger and despair are turning into anger against the international community, and in Gaza, the international community is better known as UNRWA. Mr. President, nearly 70% of those reported killed are children and women. Save the Children reported yesterday that nearly 3,200 children were killed in Gaza in just 3 weeks. This surpasses the number of children killed annually across the world's conflict zones since 2019. This cannot be collateral damage. Churches, mosques, hospitals, and UNRWA facilities, including those sheltering displaced people, have not been spared. Too many people have been killed and injured while seeking safety in places protected by international humanitarian law. The current siege imposed on Gaza is collective punishment. 2 weeks of full siege followed by the trickle of aid last week mean that basic services are crumbling, medicine is running out, food and water are running out, fuel is running out. The streets of Gaza have started overflowing with sewage, which will cause a massive health hazard very soon. In the latest blow, the communication blackout over the weekend has aggravated the panic and distress of people. The blackout meant that people could not communicate with their loved ones inside Gaza to know who is dead or who is alive. They no longer knew whether they would receive bread from UNRWA. They felt abandoned and cut off from the rest of the world. The communication blackout has accelerated the breaking down of civil order. Panic pushed thousands of desperate people to head to the UNRWA warehouses and distribution center, where we store the food and other supply we started receiving via Egypt last week. A further breakdown in civil order will make it extremely difficult, if not impossible, for the largest UN agency in Gaza to continue operating. It will also make it impossible to bring in convoys. I say this while being fully aware that UNRWA is the last remaining lifeline for the Palestinian people in Gaza. Member of the Council, UNRWA is calling on you for support. I lost 64 colleagues in just over 3 weeks. The last tragic passing confirmed was 2 hours ago. Samir, head of security and safety in the Middle region, was killed with his wife and 8 children. This is the highest number of UN aid workers killed in a conflict in such a short time. My 13,000 colleagues in Gaza are from a community of 1.7 million Palestinian refugees out of 2.2 million residents in the Gaza Strip. Those who are alive have, for the most part, lost relatives, friends, neighbors, and are displaced like the majority of Gazans. Many of my own colleagues now live, sleep, and work in UNRWA shelters. And yet, they are showing exceptional dedication to UN value. No one can do justice to thousands of UNRWA staff who continue to work tirelessly to support their communities. These are teachers, doctors, social workers, engineers, and support staff. They are mother and father. If they were not in Gaza, they could have been your neighbor, your friends. And they are operating 150 UNRWA shelters. They are keeping 1/3 of our health center open and run 80 mobile health teams. They support the entry of humanitarian convoys and the storage and distribution of aid. They distribute the little fuel we have left to hospitals, bakeries, and shelters. My UNRWA colleagues are the only glimmer of hope for the entire Gaza Strip, a ray of light as humanity sinks into its darkest hour. But they are running out of fuel, out of water, out of food and medicine, and will soon be unable to operate. Let me be clear, the handful of convoys being allowed through Rafah is nothing compared to the needs of over 2 million people trapped in Gaza. The system in place to allow aid into Gaza is geared to fail unless there is political will to make the flow of supplies meaningful, matching the unprecedented humanitarian needs. Mr. President, Gaza has over 2 million people, half of them children. Gazans are vibrant, educated people who aspire to have normal lives, families, children, education, and dreams of a better future. Today, Gazans feel that they are not treated as other civilians. Most of them feel trapped in a war they have nothing to do with. They feel the world is equating all of them to Hamas. This is dangerous, and we know this too well from previous conflicts and crises. An entire population is being dehumanized. The atrocities of Hamas do not absolve the state of Israel from its obligation under international humanitarian law. Every war has rules, and this one is no exception. Hannah Arendt said, "The death of human empathy is one of the first and most revealing signs of a culture that is about to fall into barbarity. More than ever, Gazans deserve our empathy. Its absence will deepen the polarization in the region and further push away any prospect of peace." Mr. President, while a lot of the focus is on Gaza, I wish to reiterate that another crisis is unfolding in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. The United Nations has been sounding the alarm for months on the increased violence. Palestinian fatalities this year are the highest since the UN started to keep record in 2005. At least 115 Palestinians have been killed since October 7, including 33 children. The movement restrictions imposed across the West Bank are impacting our services, including schools and health centers. Meanwhile, the situation on the Israeli-Lebanese border is getting worse, with regular exchanges of fires and civilian casualties reported. In conclusion, I'm very worried about the potential spillover of this conflict beyond Gaza unless the following is enforced. First, there must be strict adherence to international humanitarian law. This means civilian and civilian infrastructure, including UN premises, school, hospital, places of worship, and shelter hosting civilian must be protected all over the Gaza Strip, north and south, and at all times. This is not an option, it is an obligation. Second, we need a safe, unimpeded, substantial, and continuous flow of humanitarian aid, including fuel, into the Gaza Strip and across it. For this, we need an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. Third, UNRWA still needs funds. We have the necessary and largest presence on the ground. We can deliver if we have the means and the resources, including the finances to pay staff on the front lines. UNRWA has received generous contribution towards its initial flash appeal, but without a fully funded core budget, we cannot pay salaries and deliver. Finally, in these dark times, we must not lose sight of our humanity. Our empathy should apply to all, Palestinian, Israeli, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim. The rules of war must be followed by all parties, at all times, in all places. Civilians must be protected, hostages released, and a genuine humanitarian response facilitated. An immediate humanitarian ceasefire has become a matter of life and death for millions. The present and future of Palestinian and Israeli depend on it. I urge all member states to change the trajectory of this crisis and work towards a genuine political solution before it's too late. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Lazzarini for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Catherine Russell.
Thank you to Ambassador Nusseibeh and Ambassador Franca Danesi for convening this meeting, and to members of the Security Council for this opportunity to speak about the humanitarian situation in the state of Palestine and Israel. At UNICEF, we firmly believe that the true cost of this latest escalation will be measured in children's lives, those lost to the violence and those forever changed by it. After little more than 3 weeks, the devastating tally is quickly adding up, with rampant grave violations being committed against children. According to the Palestinian Ministry of Health, more than 8,300 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, including over 3,400 children, with over 6,300 children injured. This means that more than 420 children are being killed or injured in Gaza every day, a number that should shake each of us to our core. Of course, the violence being perpetrated against children extends beyond the Gaza Strip. In the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, at least 37 children have reportedly been killed. And of course, more than 30 Israeli children have reportedly been killed, while at least 20 children remain hostage in the Gaza Strip, their fates unknown. Civilian infrastructure has also come under fierce attack. According to the World Health Organization, in Gaza, 34 attacks have been reported against healthcare facilities, including 21 hospitals. 12 of Gaza's 35 hospitals, which are also being used as shelters for displaced people, can no longer function. At least 221 schools and more than 177,000 housing units have been damaged or destroyed. Meanwhile, what little clean water remains in Gaza is quickly running out, leaving more than 2 million people in dire need. We estimate that 55% of water supply infrastructure requires repair or rehabilitation. Only one desalination plant is operating at just 5% capacity, while all 6 of Gaza's water waste treatment plants are now non-operational due to a lack of fuel or power. The lack of clean water and sanitation is on the verge of becoming a catastrophe. Unless access to clean water is urgently restored, more civilians, including children, will fall ill or die from dehydration or waterborne diseases. As if this wasn't enough, children in both Israel and the state of Palestine are experiencing terrible trauma, the consequences of which could last a lifetime. Studies have shown that violence and upheaval can induce toxic stress in children that interferes with their physical and cognitive development and causes mental health problems over both the short and the long terms. We are doing our best to reach all children in need, but the delivery of humanitarian aid, especially in Gaza, is now extremely challenging. This is due to both the current siege conditions imposed on Gaza and the highly dangerous circumstances under which our staff are operating. Some of our staff have lost close family members, including spouses and children. And of course, we are grieving with UNRWA for their staff members who have been killed. 2 days ago, we lost contact with our colleagues in Gaza when telecommunications were disrupted. This left them at even greater risk, and it made their work to help children even harder to accomplish. Excellencies, UNICEF and our partners are committed to staying on the ground to deliver for children. But make no mistake, the situation grows worse by the hour, and without an urgent end to the hostilities, I am deeply afraid for the fate of the region's children. But we and you have the power to help lift children out of this spiral of violence. I implore the Security Council to immediately adopt a resolution that reminds parties of their obligations under international law, that calls for a ceasefire, that demands the parties allow safe and unimpeded humanitarian access, that demands the immediate and safe release of all abducted children, and that urges parties to afford children the special protection to which they are entitled. The Security Council should prioritize what is now a worsening displacement crisis with more than 1.4 million people in Gaza, the majority of whom are children, now displaced. As the Secretary General has said, the order for 1.1 million Palestinian civilians to leave northern Gaza should be rescinded. Demands for hospital evacuations should also cease, given their protected status under international humanitarian law. All parties must stop violence and prevent any grave violations committed against children. We must have humanitarian access through all crossing points into the Gaza Strip through safe and efficient supply routes. And parties must ensure the safe and unimpeded movement of humanitarian supplies and personnel throughout the Gaza Strip for the delivery of humanitarian assistance, including but not limited to food, water, medicines, fuel, and electricity. Finally, measures to prevent electricity, food, water, and fuel from entering Gaza from Israel must be immediately reversed so that civilians have access to the services they need to survive. Excellencies, UNICEF was created almost 77 years ago out of the ashes of World War II. Since then, our commitment to our mission has never wavered. We advocate for the rights of every child. On behalf of all the children caught in this nightmare, we call on the world to do better. Whether they are young people attending a music festival or children going about their daily lives in Gaza, they all deserve peace. Children do not start conflicts, and they are powerless to stop them. They need all of us to put their safety and security at the forefront of our efforts, and to imagine a future where children are healthy, safe, and educated. No child deserves any less. Thank you.
I thank Mrs. Russell for her briefing. I now give the floor to Mrs. Lisa Dofton.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm delivering this statement on behalf of Emergency Relief Coordinator and Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Mr. Martin Griffiths, who is currently on mission in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory. The events that have unfolded since 7 October have been nothing short of devastating and heartbreaking. We do not forget the 1,400 people killed and thousands more injured and taken in the brutal Hamas attack. Indiscriminate rocket fire continues from Gaza into populated areas of Israel, causing more civilian casualties and displacement and trauma. We deplore that 230 people held hostage in Gaza. All hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally. We welcome all diplomatic efforts to secure their release and demand that, in the interim, they be treated humanely and be allowed to receive visits from the International Committee of the Red Cross. As you've just heard from Commissioner General Lazzarini, the situation for the more than 2 million people trapped in the Gaza Strip is catastrophic. They've now endured a siege and continuous bombardment for 23 days. According to the Ministry of Health in Gaza, more than 8,000 people have been killed, 66% of whom are said to be women and children. Tens of thousands more have been injured. The scale of the horror people are experiencing in Gaza is really hard to convey. People are becoming increasingly desperate as they search for food, water, and shelter amid the relentless bombing campaign that's wiping out whole families and entire neighborhoods. In their desperation, people have resorted to breaking into UN warehouses in search of food and water. Dehydration is an increasing concern, as is the possibility of the spread of disease and other health concerns due to unsafe water and breakdown in sewage treatment services. More than 1.4 million people are internally displaced in Gaza, and hundreds of thousands of children, women, and men are crammed into overcrowded shelters and hospitals. Many of these people have moved south in search of safety. But the reality is that nowhere is safe, and we simply don't have enough essential supplies to provide for the survival of internally displaced people at this scale. As we heard from Executive Director Russell, the healthcare system is in tatters. Patients lie on the floors and in corridors. Surgeons are operating without anesthesia. Out of an estimated 50,000 pregnant women, 5,500 are due to deliver within the next 30 days. For the 1,000 patients dependent on dialysis and the 130 premature babies in incubators, life hangs by a thread as hospital backup generators run on fumes. Some 9,000 cancer patients are not receiving adequate care. We're deeply concerned by allegations of military installations in the close vicinity of hospitals and the request by Israeli authorities for hospitals, including Al-Quds and Shifa, to be evacuated. There's nowhere safe for these patients to go. And for those on life support and babies in incubators, moving would almost certainly be a death sentence. Mr. President, the provision of humanitarian relief is extremely complex and challenging due to the bombardment, the destruction of infrastructure, and as we've said repeatedly, the lack of fuel. We mourn the loss of 64 UNRWA colleagues and other humanitarian staff who've been tragically killed, and we extend our deepest condolences to the families and colleagues. We have the utmost admiration for the bravery, selflessness, and commitment of humanitarian workers who are delivering aid to those in need in this perilous environment. Mr. President, we welcome the agreement that has allowed us to get some relief into Gaza via the Rafah border crossing, but these deliveries are a drop in the ocean compared to the vast scale of needs. It's imperative that we're able to get humanitarian supplies and relief into Gaza safely, reliably, without impediment, and at the scale required. In particular, urgent for us to replenish fuel supplies, which are vital for powering most essential services, including hospitals and water desalination plants, and to transport humanitarian relief inside Gaza. And more than one entry point into Gaza is indispensable if we are to make a difference. Karim Shalom between Israel and Gaza is the only crossing equipped to rapidly process a sufficiently large number of trucks. Meanwhile, in the West Bank, scores of civilians have been killed and incidents of settler violence have increased, causing hundreds of civilians to be displaced. Likewise, the violence and closure of checkpoints has impeded access to essential services and food distribution. The permits of some 150,000 to 175,000 Palestinians from the West Bank working in Israel and settlements are now suspended. The situation is causing significant damage to the West Bank economy and Palestinian institutions. We have very real fears about what lies ahead. The current situation may pale in comparison with what is to come. There's a genuine risk that this war could escalate further and spill over into wider region. We must take urgent collective action to prevent this. Mr. President, in light of all that has been described today, what we're calling for is for the parties to agree to pause the fighting on humanitarian grounds. It would provide the required calm and safety for hostages to be released and for the UN to replenish supplies, relieve exhausted personnel, and resume assistance throughout Gaza wherever civilians are in need. It would also provide much-needed respite to civilians who are living under unimaginably traumatic conditions. But with or without a pause in the fighting, I reiterate that all parties on all sides must respect international humanitarian law. This means allowing relief in and taking constant care to spare civilians and civilian objects, including humanitarian and medical workers, facilities, and assets. And this applies whether civilians move or they stay. We are relying on the responsibility of every member state here and across the UN to use all of their influence to ensure that the rules of war are respected and that as far as is possible, civilians are spared further suffering. Thank you, Mr. President.
You're watching Al Jazeera. It is 20:08 GMT. We're bringing you coverage of the UN Security Council emergency meeting whilst Israel is carrying out its ground invasion on Gaza. You heard from Lisa Doughton there, speaking on behalf of the Emergency Relief Coordinator, Martin Griffiths, describing the conditions in Gaza as people run out of food, water, fuel and medical care. We've also heard from the UNICEF Executive Director, Catherine Russell, saying that UNICEF firmly believes the true cost of this latest escalation would be measured in children's lives, those lost to the violence and those forever changed by it. We also, before that, heard from Mr. Philippe Lazzarini, the Commissioner General of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, commonly known as UNRWA, for the Palestinian refugees in the Near East. He says, "My UNRWA colleagues are the only glimmer of hope for the entire Gaza Strip, a ray of light as humanity sinks into its darkest hours." And all of that happening, as you can see, a nighttime shot of the Gaza skyline there with flashes as the airstrikes continue and plumes of smoke over parts of the skyline. I want to bring in our diplomatic editor, James Bays, who's been joining me here in the studio, and you were listening to, of course, to that. There was a UN General Assembly special session that was held a couple of days ago, and the Security Council came in for a lot of criticism for not having been able to achieve anything. But perhaps this kind of briefing shows exactly why the Security Council is important.
Why it needs to act, I think. That this is such a sobering assessment of the situation coming from three top humanitarian officials. And some of those statistics, 70% of the people who've died are women and children. Save the Children reporting that the children have died in Gaza in just 3 weeks. That's as many children have died in conflict zones around the world for the last 4 years. Another statistic from UNICEF, they think that if you look at the figures, it's more than 420 children being killed or injured in Gaza every single day, and the number of UN staff. UNRWA, the UN agency that deals with Palestinians, has lost 64 staff in 3 weeks. That's the highest number of UN staff killed in a conflict in that period of time. They really are shocking statistics. And what we're seeing now, I think, is growing international condemnation of Israel and Israel's battle plan taking place. You've seen it, as you say, in the General Assembly with that vote, overwhelming vote, 120 countries in favour, just 14 against a humanitarian ceasefire coming into play. You're seeing it from the humanitarian agencies as they report what's going on the ground, and you saw it from Karim Khan, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, when he went to the Rafah crossing. All of this pressure on Israel, but of course we saw live a couple of hours ago Prime Minister Netanyahu saying there will be no ceasefire. Ceasefire amounts to surrender, is what he said.
I was talking to Marwan Caroline, our guest, just within the last half hour. He was making an interesting point that although Netanyahu may be determined to avoid a ceasefire, because as he sees it, that's a capitulation, a giving in to Hamas, the wording of this that we've heard over the last, certainly from the last three speakers, is an increasing call for a humanitarian pause, a humanitarian truce. And to some degree, in your opinion, how much does this come down to semantics, in as much that Israel would not go for a ceasefire, but it might go for a temporary pause to allow some sort of humanitarian action?
Well, a pause is a ceasefire. It's just a ceasefire for a specified period of time, that the firing stops, ceases for a time, the pause that is determined. Certainly, I think it's going to be increasingly hard for the United States, which is the one that has been defending Israel in the Security Council, to keep up its current position. We know that the elected members of the Security Council, led by Malta and the United Arab Emirates, are putting efforts in to try and get a new resolution. We're told that they've got a new text that they're now trying to negotiate with the other countries. And, you know, the United States is not separate from all of this. It's worth noting, for example, Catherine Russell, who gave that quite impassioned speech as the head of UNICEF. Her previous job, she's an American, was in the White House working for President Biden. So these people talk to each other, and there'll be growing pressure, I think, coming. We're seeing it with the protests on the streets, growing pressure on the US administration to at least have a humanitarian pause. Will the Israelis accept that, or are the Israelis going to be completely isolated without even the US supporting them?
I want to ask you about this resolution. You mentioned that this meeting was at the request of the United Arab Emirates, and I believe that the resolution, as you mentioned, is going to be co-sponsored by them. How significant is it, do you think, that the UAE is calling this meeting? Because there was a lot of speculation that the UAE was open to some sort of normalizing of relations with Israel at one point.
Yeah, it is one of the Abraham Accords countries. So, yes, it is one of those that has gone quite a long way to normalise its relations with Israel. And we've seen in the last year or so flights going between Abu Dhabi and Dubai and Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv. We've seen Israeli tourists, Israeli business delegations making that journey. So, yes, it is interesting that the UAE is taking this position, but the UAE is not just acting as the UAE. The UAE is the current Arab member of the Security Council, so they are the one acting on behalf of the Arab countries in this regard.
One of the things that you've talked to us about before is the fact that the wording of any resolution is pored over in great detail by those involved. Is there any sort of speculation about what this resolution might have that might be different from the previous ones, that might allow it to move further than the previous ones?
Well, I haven't seen, and I know that my colleagues who are at the UN, Gabriel and the team there, haven't yet seen the wording of the new resolution. But what we do know is that the 10 elected members of the Security Council are working on this together, leaving out the permanent members because some observers believe the permanent members are the ones that have caused trouble on this to this point. And they've come up, I believe, with a text which they're now going to share with the permanent members to see if they can go forward. Certainly their aim was to look at the previous resolutions that had been passed, that had gone to the Security Council and either failed to pass or had been vetoed, and see whether there was compromise language, choose the best bits of those resolutions to see if they could find something that can go past all 15 members of the Security Council without the veto being used. But of course they have more power now because they have behind them that General Assembly, overwhelming General Assembly vote. All of the Security Council know where the rest of the world stand on this, and overwhelmingly the rest of the world would like to see aid delivered and a pause in the fighting to get that aid delivered.
James, as always, great to get your analysis. Thank you very much indeed. Our diplomatic editor, James Bass. Well, if you've just joined us, there have been a number of speakers at the UN Security Council. The head of UNICEF says a lack of clean water and safe sanitation in Gaza is pushing the territory to the verge of becoming a catastrophe. The chief of the UN's humanitarian agency warned that international law must be respected in this war. And the system in place allowing aid into Gaza is geared to fail. And the head of the UN's Agency for Palestinian Refugees says the situation in Gaza is becoming increasingly alarming.
Nearly 70% of those reported killed are children and women. Save the Children reported yesterday that nearly 3,200 children were killed in Gaza in just 3 weeks. This surpasses the number of children killed annually across the world's conflict zones since 2019. This cannot be collateral damage. Churches, mosques, hospitals, and UNRWA facilities, including those sheltering displaced people, have not been spared. Too many people have been killed and injured while seeking safety in places protected by international humanitarian law.
Israel's Prime Minister has just told the world that he will not agree to a ceasefire. Unsparing and unrelenting, Israel's airstrikes are continuing through the night in Gaza. At least 8,300 Palestinians have been killed in 24 days of war. Earlier, Israeli tanks were seen in the outskirts of Gaza City on the main road linking northern and southern Gaza. Overstretched with patients and low on supplies, hospitals in Gaza are struggling under pressure. 23 hospitals in northern Gaza are under an evacuation order. You can see them marked here in red. In the south, hospitals have no capacity. On Monday, Israeli airstrikes hit the Turkish hospital. It's the only facility that treats cancer patients. There's been extensive damage done to its third floor. In a televised speech, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu drew a distinction between Israelis killed in Hamas attacks and the Palestinian casualties from the bombardment of Gaza.
It means making a moral distinction between the deliberate murder of the innocent and the unintentional casualties that accompany every legitimate war, even the most just war. I want to make clear Israel's position regarding a ceasefire. Just as the United States would not agree to a ceasefire after the bombing of Pearl Harbor or after the terrorist attack of 9/11, Israel will not agree to a cessation of hostilities with Hamas after the horrific attacks of October 7th.
Well, the US says it and Israel are committed to supporting an increase of aid to Gaza. Relief workers have said even the largest aid convoy to enter Gaza so far has fallen short of the needs there.
In the call with Prime Minister Netanyahu did receive a commitment that the Israelis will endeavor to support a significant increase in the flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza, so additional trucks. And we had 45 or so get in yesterday. We're hoping that we can get some more in today, but obviously, even with the increase, it's going to take time to make up the difference, and we know there's an awful lot that needs to happen to accelerate and to increase that flow of aid.
Well, in a moment, we're going to cross to Gabriel Elizondo, who's been monitoring developments at the UN Security Council in New York. First, we're going to go to Tariq Abu Azum in Khan Yunis in Gaza. Talk us through what you're aware of with regard to the expanding ground operation the Israelis apparently are carrying out.
Yes, practically Israel is expanding its wide-scale military invasion to the territory in different areas, from the north up to the southern areas of the Gaza Strip. Now, at this current moment, the Israeli occupation troops are trying to push forward into Al-Zaytun neighborhood in the central areas of the Gaza Strip, in the Shuja'iyya neighborhood, in the Shuja'iyya district. This district considered to be one of the most adjacent places to the Israeli-Gaza borders. The Israeli-Gaza borders. Also, the attacks continued, and fire exchange could be clearly overheard in the Al-Bureid refugee camp eastern areas. The fighting has been erupted between Palestinian fighters who are responding to the Israeli infiltration and even the Israeli ground movement on the ground, as they are trying to attack military tanks and even to open fire against the Israeli maneuvering troops on the ground. The attacks clearly has been intensified during the last couple of hours, and even specifically the last hour, the Palestinian Orthodox Cultural Center has been leveled to the ground by the Israeli occupation forces. Also, the attacks included different airstrikes that have been conducted near different affiliated United Nations schools in the north of the Gaza Strip, which contains thousands of Palestinians who fled from the houses from the north, from the different and separate areas of the territory. The attacks continued to be hit in the surrounding areas of Gaza hospitals, as the Israeli occupation forces have threatened the majority of Gaza hospitals for evacuation orders.
Tariq, we were saying earlier that Israeli tanks had been seen in the outskirts of Gaza City on the main road linking northern and southern Gaza, and yet people in Gaza are getting messages to say that they should head towards the south. One would imagine that's difficult for them to do if these roads are blocked.
Now, since the early beginning of this war, Israel has ordered and recommended the citizens of the north and central areas of Gaza Strip to move to the southern areas. Now, meanwhile, she is cutting this road and break it down in order to make a proper control over the aforementioned areas. An Israeli tank managed to carry out a limited maneuvering by controlling the area and taking control over the Salah ad-Din road, which is considered to be one of the central roads in the Gaza Strip. Now, people are no longer able to evacuate from the northern areas now to the southern areas, and you are talking about hundreds of thousands of Palestinians are still in the northern and central areas of the Gaza Strip. Only in the Shifa hospital there are more than 50,000 Palestinians are residing in the surrounding areas of the complex. Now, with this surging number, it would be really difficult for them to evacuate as the Israeli ongoing strikes and ground invasion expands in the territory.
Tariq, thank you very much indeed. That's Tariq Abu Azum talking to us from Khan Yunis in Gaza. Let's go to Gabriel Elizondo, who's live for us at the United Nations. Just in the last hour or so, Gabe, we've heard some very impassioned speeches from aid agencies to the Security Council. Just talk us through, for people who are just joining us, what's been said and what the tone is.
Yeah, this is an emergency Security Council meeting that was called by the UAE, where they're getting these briefings from top officials from relief agencies of the United Nations. That's the big picture. The Security Council members are trying to get a sense of really what's happening, get a briefing from the top officials in the know, if you will. And it was a very somber briefing from three different officials, to put it mildly. It was quite troubling to hear a lot of the different numbers that were shared about the human suffering that so many people in Gaza are suffering. You know, we heard that 3,400 children have been killed, and that averages to about 420 children killed or injured every day in Gaza since this conflict began. But I think there's really four big themes that we heard. Number one is that everyone that spoke was calling for some sort of a ceasefire to be in place immediately because of the humanitarian conditions. I think number two, as you saw, all three briefers in some way, shape, or form talk about humanitarian law must be upheld. One briefer said it's an obligation of Israel to uphold international law during this. And then what was really striking is, I think, these UN agencies are the ones that are usually the ones that are trying to help other people. But you heard them asking for help and them saying, we cannot provide the kind of help that we need to provide. The humanitarian situation is getting so bad, and if it continues to deteriorate.
Gabriel, thank you very much indeed. Gabriel Elizondo talking to us from the United Nations in New York. Well, the spokesman for the military wing of the Palestinian group Islamic Jihad has just spoken about the captives held in Gaza. In a statement, the group says, to the families of our captives, your government is risking the lives of your children to gain time. Every minute that passes is a threat to the lives of its prisoners. Well, separately, Hamas released a video of 3 captives it's holding in Gaza. In the video that Al Jazeera English has decided not to show, one directly addresses Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, saying, quote, we are bearing the responsibility of your political, security and military failure on October the 7th. There was no army. No one arrived. No one protected us. It continues, we are innocent citizens who pay taxes to Israel. We are in captivity in a bad condition. You are killing us. And she goes on to say, release us now. Release their citizens, release their prisoners, release all of us. Let us go back to our families. I'm going to go straight to Alan Fisher, who's joining us live from occupied East Jerusalem. Alan, I want to ask you more about Benjamin Netanyahu's statement. The clip that we had mentioned before was just a small part of a much larger statement. What else was he saying?
Well, this is him in front of the foreign media for the first time since October the 7th. He spoke in English throughout, as you would expect, addressing the foreign media. He's very fluent, obviously, having spent a number of years in the United States. And his message was directed to an international audience as well. He talked about why there would be no ceasefire. He said there was no ceasefire after Pearl Harbor. There was no ceasefire after 9/11. And when he was talking about how some civilians are being killed, he said the Israelis are trying to avoid all possible impact on civilians, and contrasted that with Hamas, who kidnapped and killed civilians. He also made the point about the bombing of the Gestapo headquarters in Copenhagen during the Second World War. The British thought that that's what they were targeting. They actually hit a children's hospital. Of course, technology has moved on quite markedly since then, and there are many in Gaza who would argue that they are being targeted because they are in Gaza, pointing to the fact that they were told to move from the northern part of the Strip to the south, and the south is still under fire. But this was Benjamin Netanyahu coming out quite strongly, quite forcibly, a lot stronger than he was when he spoke to local media in Israel on Saturday night, and certainly making very clear that while there may be international calls for a ceasefire, he's called for the international community to stand by Israel, and he will not be calling a ceasefire. He sees that as surrender.
Alan, thank you very much. That's Alan Fisher talking to us from the occupied East Jerusalem. You're watching Al Jazeera. We're bringing you live coverage of the UN Security Council emergency meeting on the situation in Gaza. Mr. Philip Lazzarini, Commissioner General of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East, said the last 3 weeks have been horrific. Almost everyone in Israel, the occupied Palestinian territory, and the broader region is in mourning.